The snow had stopped some time last night. Now, beneath the dense conifers of the Ardennes Forest, there was only one kind of white, compacted, airless, dead. 19-year-old Jacob sat with his back against the thick, knotted roots of a spruce, trying to fold himself deeper into the shadow. The German field jacket hanging on him was too large and soaked through with meltwater and mud, its color mottled, the cuffs worn down to gray-white stuffing. It was not his jacket. A few days ago, or perhaps last week, time had become sticky and indistinct in retreat. A Wehrmacht soldier with his belly ripped open by shrapnel had collapsed beside a foxhole, eyes fixed on a lead-gray sky. Jacob had needed something heavier against cold that had suddenly dropped below freezing. He had stripped off his own low-profile, mottled auxiliary coat and pulled on the dead man's uniform, still smelling of powder, blood, and someone else's body heat. In that moment, he had treated it as a simple trade: fabric for warmth, survival for scruple. Only later did the logic of it tighten around him like wire. He had treated it as a simple trade: a coat for warmth, a dead man's fabric for another day of breathing. Only later did he understand what he had pulled over his shoulders. The uniform was more than cloth. It was a verdict. To American eyes, it made him a German soldier, an enemy who could be shot without questions. To many Germans, it made him something else: a young face in a stolen field jacket, a reminder of collapse, a boy who might be punished to stop other boys from vanishing. The jacket did not protect him. It labeled him. It fixed him in a role he no longer believed in and could not safely abandon. The sounds came from the west: boots cracking the crusted snow, low-clipped commands in English, the soft rasp of metal and canvas straps, not the sharp, urgent cadence of German patrols. Jacob held his breath until his muscles locked. The thought of running flared, darted once, and died. Where could he go? To the east, the front line pressed closer. To the west, Allied territory, and the forest itself was seeded with scattered soldiers, mines, and despair. He was like a stone flung by chance into no man's land, now a stone that could be kicked aside by whoever found it. Over there, under the roots. Their eyes and their muzzles arrived together. Several tall soldiers in winter gear advanced in a practice skirmish line, barrels steady on the shallow depression where he lay. No shouting, no reckless rush, only calm control that left no space to bargain. Jacob raised his hand slowly, fingers unable to fully straighten from cold and fear. A soldier motioned him out with a submachine gun, the gesture clear and absolute. Jacob stumbled from his hiding place and stood in the open, thin light falling across his face and across the blurred insignia on a uniform that did not fit him. The procedure began at once. 2 soldiers stepped in. One kept watch while the other, older by a few years, eyes more tired than murderous, searched him. The movements were quick and methodical, patting every pocket, underarms, along the inside seams of his trousers. They found almost nothing: an empty tin canteen, half a piece of black bread wrapped in grease paper and hard as stone, and a family photograph that had been soaked and half dried again, the faces smeared into shadow. The soldier set the items in his own palm as if laying evidence on a table, then returned them to Jacob's pockets with the same neutrality. "ID?" the soldier with the submachine gun asked, voice raw. The older one, his collar insignia marked him as a sergeant, studied Jacob's young face, caked with grime and exhaustion, then looked again at the ill-fitting uniform. "Straggler, maybe Volksgrenadier, more likely drafted." He spoke in English, then turned to Jacob and switched to German with a heavy accent that was still clear enough. "Unit? Number?" Chekhov's lips moved, but no sound came. What could he say? Give the number of an auxiliary battalion that no longer existed? Claim he had fought as a German soldier and be caught in the lie? Admit he had no papers, no unit, no place? Fear closed around his throat. He only shook his head, a small movement that felt like surrender. The sergeant did not press. He pulled a small notebook and a short pencil from his chest pocket, and, using the snow's pale reflection as light, wrote a few lines. Then he told the others, tag him as suspected straggler, no valid identification. Per procedure, send him to regimental HQ interrogation. That was the first time Jacob heard the word procedure. It was not a threat, it was a statement, an impersonal machine already turning. He was ordered into the middle of the file, one soldier in front and one behind. The march began. The sergeant walked slightly ahead and to the side, stopping now and then to unfold a battered map and match it to terrain while checking a compass strapped to his wrist. Jacob caught the fine contour lines and dense German labels, a Wehrmacht tactical map. Across the top, in crisp English pen, someone had stamped a captured map designation. Even this piece of enemy paper had been pressed into proper service. They moved through thick stands of spruce and fir where the wind cut like wire. Jacob's wrists were tied in front. He could still feel his fingers, but not by much. The soldier behind him kept close enough that Jacob could smell tobacco and wet wool. No one struck him. No one promised him life. They simply moved him, as if he were a crate that needed to be delivered intact to the next step. The route was long and quiet. The soldiers murmured only occasionally, left, watch the right, 5-minute break. Their fatigue was obvious, but their discipline held. Jacob noticed the sergeant, he heard the others call him Johnson, would, at every short halt, check each man's position and condition, retighten the bandage on a young soldier's wrapped arm, and only then sit down himself to take a sip from his canteen. With Jacob, he followed an unseen set of regulations, a mouthful of cold water at a controlled pace, a check that the binding was secure without cutting skin, a count of minutes for rest before movement resumed. When Jacob's shivering worsened, no one offered comfort, but no one mocked him either. They treated him like a problem to be handled correctly, because the mishandling of problems created more problems. That watchfulness confused Jacob more than cruelty would have. In what he had been taught and in what he had seen in the war's worst places, the enemy was supposed to be a creature of destruction. Johnson and his men behaved as if they were moving a troublesome item through a chain of custody. Jacob, as a person, felt temporarily suspended. He had become a question the system would answer later. The dissonance did not comfort him. It left him unmoored, as if the world's rules had been swapped when he was not looking. By late afternoon, the light dropped fast through the trees. They paused beneath a lee slope to spend the night and reached the rendezvous point with daylight. The soldiers set a rotating watch. No fire, no loud conversation. Johnson unfolded the captured map again and studied the route under the dim cone of a hooded flashlight, brow tight. Jacob sat bound to a small tree, watching. Then, without warning, the first shell screamed through the air. It was not direct fire, more like blind coverage from distant guns, but the impact was terrifyingly close. The first blast erupted left front, snow and mud and shattered branches flinging skyward. The second came closer. "Incoming! Spread out! Get cover!" Johnson's shout cut clean through the echo. The squad reacted on reflex, each man diving for a hollow or the lee of a trunk. Johnson's eyes snapped over his men, then locked on Jacob, tied to the tree. Another shell howled in, the sound rising and sharpening. Johnson cursed in rough English. He did not run for a safer hollow. He sprinted toward Jacob and slammed him and the sapling down, then pressed his body over Jacob and dragged them a few feet so their position hugged the edge of a shallow depression. The blast landed almost on top of them. Shock, heat, dirt, and snow clods raining down. Jacob's head rang, his lungs seized. For a few seconds he could not breathe and could not think, only flinch. Then the weight lifted. Johnson knelt nearby, breathing hard, face pale in the dim. His helmet was gone. Blood trickled from a cut at his temple. He seemed not to care. His eyes swept Jacob. "You hit?" Jacob shook his head, stunned. Johnson's voice snapped back into control. "Report, Miller. White?" "White's got a fragment graze on the leg. Needs dressing." "Miller's good." "Rodriguez is good." Johnson dropped to one knee and dressed White's wound with practiced speed. Pressure, wrap, tie. His temple blood dotted the snow. He acted as if he felt nothing. The others formed a perimeter, rifles out, watching for follow-up fire or a ground contact. The barrage faded as abruptly as it had come, leaving the kind of silence that makes every breath sound like a confession. Jacob watched from the dirt with the rope still on him. The fear of shelling still pulsed, but something else moved underneath it. This man who had covered him, who bled while tending his soldier, who held the group together in chaos, followed rules Jacob did not understand. The enemy in his head did not have room for that. The thought was dangerous, and it would not leave. It slid into the cracks in Jacob's certainty and widened them. The brief halt ended in taut silence. White's leg was wrapped. Johnson wiped his own blood away with snow melt and slapped a field dressing on. They moved out again. Johnson checked the map and compass, ordered them northeast toward regimental headquarters. Jacob's wrists were examined and retied, and he was placed in the middle, but Johnson adjusted the formation, walking a step behind and to Jacob's side. It was not menace. It was the system tightening its grip after a threat to itself had presented. Jacob's heart kept racing, but not from fear alone. It was calculation. The Americans did not hold maximum alertness every second on the move. Their exhaustion created gaps, and Johnson's attention was split between the squad, the map, and the terrain. Jacob needed a moment of confusion. He needed it to be quick, silent, and irreversible. They reached a frozen creek, the ice slick, the banks bare and stony. The soldiers helped one another across. When Jacob's turn came, he deliberately slipped in the middle, gave a sharp cry, and fell hard. The escort reached out on instinct, balance pulled off. Jacob used the roll of his fall and lunged toward the far bank's brush, mind narrowed to one command, disappear. He did not make it. A boot pinned the rope, trailing from his wrists. Jacob twisted his head and saw Johnson standing beside him. There was no anger in his face, only weary resignation. The others closed in, muzzles lowered but ready, sealing the edges of the world. Record: prisoner attempted escape at approximately 17:30 while crossing Cleve Creek, Johnson said in English, calm as if speaking into a report. He hauled Jacob up, searched him again, then bound Jacob's wrists in front with a shorter, stronger rope and tied the other end to his own web belt. Tethered restraint, White, take flank security, focus east. No beating, no lecture, only tightened measures and updated documentation. Jacob panted, shame and helplessness flooding him. He understood then that he was not living in a gap between cruelty and mercy. He was inside a procedure built to anticipate him. His struggle did not register as tragedy. It registered as a line item, a risk addressed, a notation made. Night settled completely. They bivouacked in a stand of pines without lighting a fire. The men chewed cold K rations and spoke softly about what might be waiting tomorrow. Hot coffee, real cigarettes, maybe mail. Jacob was given half a compressed biscuit and a little water. He sat tethered to a tree, allowed to rest. Johnson sat on a fallen log and spread the map again, studying tomorrow's route under muffled light. His jaw worked once, as if grinding down fatigue. After a long stretch of silence, Johnson sighed. His fingers rubbed absently over the map's blank margin. He spoke in English, clearly not to anyone in particular. "This damn place twists worse than the canyons down by the Blanco River. Texas doesn't have this many trees. From my porch you can see clear to the horizon. It'd be dusk now. Sun on the tumbleweeds, all gold, not this gray and white." Jacob did not catch every word, but he caught Texas, home, dusk, gold. For a moment the map stopped being only a seized tool. It became a bridge to a porch, a horizon, a life that had nothing to do with this forest. Jacob tried to crush the thought as weakness, but the image stayed. Open land, evening light, the idea that the man watching him had a place where his boots were not caked with mud. The bridge hurt more than it soothed because it made the enemy look like a person. Jacob turned his face away as if looking might make the thought treason. The next day the weather worsened into fine, freezing rain, visibility dropping. The rope linking Jacob to Johnson's belt restricted his movement and kept him close enough to see the sergeant's exhaustion deepen. Shadows under Johnson's eyes looked bruised, but his rhythm, checking the map, issuing signals, adjusting formation, held steady. Procedure made muscle out of will. By afternoon they neared a junction along a forest road. Ahead came a short, violent burst of small arms fire a few hundred yards away. An engagement. Johnson raised his fist. The squad froze and crouched, muzzles aimed toward the sound. It did not sound large, but it was fierce. MP-40 bursts and the crisp crack of American M1 rifles. New chaos, a possible opening. Jacob's heart hammered. The firefight drew everyone's attention, including Johnson's. The sergeant pushed 2 men forward to recon and held the others ready to support or reroute. As Johnson turned, the rope slackened slightly. Jacob tensed and yanked backward, trying to rip free or at least jerk Johnson off balance long enough to roll into the roadside ditch. Before the attempt could fully form, the sky arrived. A different scream, one that covered everything. Artillery, many rounds, incoming from far away, their howl joining into a single destructive chorus. This was no scattered coverage like yesterday. This was a dense salvo meant to pulverize the whole patch of forest. "Incoming! Scatter! Maximum cover!" Johnson shouted. But the first impact swallowed the order. The world became noise and rupture. Fireballs punched through the trees. Trunks snapped and flew. Dirt, rock, ice, and torn gear mixed in the blast wash and rained back down. Jacob was thrown by a shock wave at arm's length. His ears filled with ringing that swallowed all other sound. The rope between him and Johnson went taut, then seemed to snap or slip free in the violence. He rolled, clawing toward a crater he had glimpsed through smoke. A figure in front of him was lifted and dropped hard, never moving again. The air tasted of cordite and something sweet and metallic. Another shell hit closer. Shards hissed through the air. Just as Jacob believed he would be cut apart, a heavy shape burst from the smoke and took him with it, rolling toward the crater's lip. "Johnson!" They fell together into wet mud and debris. At the same instant, a blast detonated where they had been. The crater edge was sheared away, and earth poured down, nearly burying them. In the brief lull between shocks, Jacob spat mud and felt the weight on him turn inert. Johnson lay across him, motionless. There was not much blood on his face, but it was paper white. His eyes were shut. His breathing was rapid and shallow, wet in a way that made Jacob's skin crawl. On Johnson's back, Near the right shoulder, a dark patch spread fast. A twisted slab of metal, roughly palm-size, was embedded in the canvas and padding. Most of it had likely driven into him. Johnson convulsed once and cracked his eyes open. His gaze found Jacob with a clarity that did not belong to a dying man. He did not look at the wound and did not call for a medic. Under that kind of fire, calling would be useless. The crater was an island. With effort, he lifted his left hand and reached into his chest pocket caked with mud and blood. His fingers fumbled out the small notebook he had used for notes and sketches, and the folded German tactical map, its edges smeared with fresh blood. The thunder drifted away and became a dull rolling on the horizon, leaving a hollowed-out silence. Snow began to fall again, fine ice crystals settling on Johnson's cheek and on the stained fabric. Jacob could hear his own harsh breathing, and Johnson's breath, thinner now, wet at the end. Johnson gathered himself and slid the map and notebook toward Jacob. The motion pulled at the wound. His body spasmed, sweat breaking cold on his brow, but he clamped his teeth and forced the words out in German. "Take." Jacob stared. "Take what? Why?" Johnson's impatience flickered. He tossed the notebook aside into the mud. It fell open, pages crowded with English notes that meant nothing to Jacob. Johnson focused on the map. His shaking fingers tried to open it, but the simple movement defeated him. Jacob reached out despite himself and helped unfold one corner. The cold, blood-wet paper made his fingers flinch. Next to the printed German labels were Johnson's pencil arrows. Johnson's fingertip, sticky with blood, moved across the forest area, east, then farther east, until it reached the map's edge and the blank margin beyond. His nail scraped the paper and left a shallow gouge pointing toward the east. "Home," he forced out, the German word rough on his tongue. Then, in broken phrases, "Not prisoner. Go home. Understand?" The words struck Jacob with a force he could not brace against. Not a POW. Go home. Command and permission in the same breath. The map, moments ago a captured tool used under regulation, changed nature in Jacob's hands. It became a token, a permission, a direction paid for with a life. For a second, Jacob wanted to argue, to refuse, to say he was no one's responsibility and no one's gift. But there was nothing to argue with. There was only the weight of a dying man's decision. Johnson's grip loosened. The paper slid and covered Jacob's knees. Johnson exhaled, wet with blood, and stared past Jacob at the gray sky where snow fell in silence. Then he was still. For several breaths, Jacob could only stare. The map lay across his knees like a heavy cloth, its paper slick with mud and blood. He had spent months treating language and uniforms as traps, treating every hand extended toward him as a hand that would close into a fist. Now a man who had called him prisoner in the same tone he used for a compass bearing had spent his last strength on a different instruction. The strangest part was not mercy, it was precision. Johnson had not told him to pray, to repent, to surrender to any tribunal. He had told him to go home, as if home were a direction on the map and not an impossible wish. Jacob felt the old categories collapse inside him. Enemy, ally, guilty, innocent. They did not vanish, but they stopped being clean. He could not decide whether to hate this man for dying on him or to revere him for refusing to let procedure finish its work. He could only accept that the map in his hands was no longer evidence against him. It was a task. Jacob did not move. Time seemed to stop inside the crater. Enemy and ally, uniform and identity, prisoner and procedure, everything that had governed the last months cracked and fell away. Johnson had thrown himself over him under shells, bandaged a man while bleeding, spoken of a porch at dusk, and finally spent his last strength to push Jacob toward life. The shock was not gentle. It burned. Tears rose hot against mud and froze on his cheeks, not only for the man who had died, but for the world in Jacob's head that had insisted such a death could not happen. The forest fell under an ominous quiet. Jacob sat beside the body and the map until cold shook him back into motion. Somewhere beyond the trees a few shots cracked, then faded. He could not tell whether they were distant fighting or finishing. Either way, no one came for them. He laid Johnson's body flat with as much care as he could manage. He placed the discarded notebook back near Johnson's chest. Then he folded the map carefully and slid it into his inner pocket. No other soldiers were alive nearby. Only bodies, some American, some German. Near another dead American, he found a half-empty canvas pack, a few remaining K rations, a canteen with a little water, a first aid kit, a handful of small odds and ends, and a folded olive drab American field jacket, worn but thick. Jacob stripped off the filthy German field jacket that had become a death mark and put on the American one. It was slightly large but workable. When he changed coats, he found a small metal identification tag from Johnson, and he took it without fully understanding why. It felt like the only way to keep a name attached to what had happened. He also kept his own blurred family photograph, and he tucked both items against the map, all three pressed together as if they could steady him. Burial was impossible. The ground was frozen iron hard. Jacob gathered thicker branches and stones and covered Johnson's body as respectfully as he could, building a crude cairn that would at least mark a place. When he finished, he knelt before it and said in German, "Thank you, Sergeant. I will go home." Night fell. The snow stopped. A tear in the clouds revealed a few hard stars. Jacob climbed out of the crater and looked back one last time at the wrecked clearing and the new mound of stones. Then he turned east. He could not read the map in the dark, so he found the North Star, fixed east by it, and matched that to the gouge Johnson had marked. He tucked the map against his chest. There, too, he kept the identification tag and the blurred photograph. He shouldered the canvas pack, adjusted the oversized collar, and stepped forward. The first step was unsteady under sudden freedom and sudden obligation. The second was steadier. He was no longer an escorted object, no longer a thing waiting to be processed. He was Jacob, carrying a bloodied map, a fixed direction, and a jacket taken from the dead by necessity. The man who had given him the direction was not an abstraction now. He was a person with a porch in Texas, a voice worn by fatigue, and a name that Jacob would later learn in full: Matthew Johnson. The map's edges grew frayed under constant handling. Beside the printed German labels and Johnson's pencil notes, Jacob added tiny marks of his own: an X for distant gunfire heard at night, a line for drinkable water, rough numbers for distance covered on foot. Spring of 1945 arrived amid chaos and slow thaw. The American jacket, his grown beard, and his wind-scoured face let him pass more easily as one more displaced straggler among countless others. He spoke rarely. When he did, it was to trade a bite of ration or a spare bandage for information about roadblocks, fighting ahead, or simply which direction had fewer patrols. He learned that questions could be as dangerous as uniforms. A wrong accent or a wrong hesitation could turn a passing glance into a stop. Some nights he slept in the husk of a barn or under a collapsed roof, wrapped in the field jacket and listening to distant rumbling. Some days he walked until his legs stopped obeying, then forced himself up again, because stopping in the wrong place could mean freezing or being seen. He learned to keep off main roads when he could, to move at first light and disappear before dusk, to read the texture of smoke on the horizon and decide whether it meant cooking fires or artillery. He began to live by small rules. He drank from streams only where the water ran clear, then marked them. He avoided roads whenever he heard engines, and when he had to cross, he did it quickly, low, and only when the light was wrong for a sentry's eyes. He rationed the K-rations down to crumbs, saving the most compact pieces for mornings when his legs threatened to stop. When he found nothing at all, he endured the hollow burn in his stomach and kept moving, because stopping in the wrong place was worse than hunger. He used the first aid kit sparingly, cleaning small cuts before they became infections, binding blisters before they tore. He learned, as if it were a new language, the difference between the silence of an empty village and the silence of a village that had soldiers hiding in it. Once he approached a road junction the map marked as an American forward supply point. Jacob hid at the tree line and watched. The place had been taken over by a unit with disciplined bearing and unfamiliar vehicle markings. British or Canadian, he could not be sure. Their accents sounded different, their posture less hurried, their perimeter more formal. To show himself might mean questioning and detention, suspicion sharpened by his accent and his jacket. He unfolded the map and chose a longer northern route through dense woods, an area the German print labeled difficult and Johnson had marked with a faint dotted line. The detour cost him time and strength, but it kept him unseen. Later, on a deserted multi-track path, a small group of refugees moving east noticed his comparatively intact gear. Their glances traded, and in tension he recognized hunger made enemies fast. Jacob did not argue and did not posture. He stepped aside, sat with his back to a tree, and spread the map across his knees as if consulting a fixed plan, finger moving, slow and certain. He made himself look like someone with a route, with a purpose, perhaps even with invisible backing. The refugees watched, then moved on, unwilling to gamble on what the map might represent. The paper in his hands protected him more effectively than any weapon he did not have. As spring deepened, roads turned to mud. Jacob passed villages shredded into ruin, rolled by burnt-out tanks, and saw hunger, grief, and blank faces. He marked safe water, sheltering ruins and places to avoid. He learned to correct his direction by sun when cloud broke, and by stars when the night cleared. The map carried two sets of traces now, Johnson's arrows and Jacob's. It was a tool, a log, and a tether to the crater where his life had been handed back to him. When he unfolded it, he did not see only routes. He saw a fingertip dragging through blood, a gouge in the blank margin, and a man forcing words out between breaths. When the trees began to look familiar and the silhouette of distant hills woke buried memory, Jacob knew he was close. At dusk he stepped onto an old road ruined by ruts and shell holes, but still recognizable. He rounded the last slope, sprouting new grass, and saw the valley, saw the small town he remembered as home. Not one building stood intact. The church tower was snapped in half, a jagged stump against a crimson sky. Streets were blocked by heaps of rubble. Many houses were nothing but foundations and a wall or two, blackened and broken. The air smelled of dust, dampness, and a faint rot. Silence lay over everything. No smoke from chimneys, no lights, no dogs, no voices. War had rolled over the place and left only debris. Jacob stood at the town's edge for a long time. He did not rush in shouting names. He walked into the ruins slowly, using fragments of memory to locate where his house had been. The two-story brick home with the small garden was gone. In its place was a crater filled with cloudy rainwater, charred beams, and broken porcelain scattered along the rim. Jacob circled it once. He found nothing. No trace of his family, no message. They might have died, been taken, or fled. In this spring, across Europe's ruins, any of those outcomes were ordinary. He did not know which was worse. He only knew that the map had brought him to emptiness. He stopped where a neighbor's cellar had once been. The entrance was partly buried, but after he pulled loose bricks, he found an opening large enough to crawl into. It was damp and cold inside, but stable. He cleared a small space and set down his pack. That night he slept there, chewing the last of his ration, listening to wind move over broken stone, listening also to his own thoughts for the first time in months without immediate fear pressing them down. In the morning he began to clear, no grand plan, only the need for shelter. He moved smaller stones, dug with a broken half-shovel he found, widened the entry, and hung a makeshift covering from boards and canvas. He searched the ruins for usable things, a dented iron pot, half a candle, a ceramic cup with tulips painted on it, miraculously intact, and scrap wood he could burn later without drawing firelight too far. He worked with the blunt concentration of survival, letting his hands move while his mind circled the same questions without answers: where his family had gone, whether anyone would return, whether the world outside the cellar would ever become more than rubble. In one dry corner he stacked stones into a small platform. Then he took out 3 items he had kept against his chest: the severely worn map, the blood dried to deep brown, Johnson's small metal identification tag, and his own blurred family photograph. He placed them side by side and spread the map flat, its eastern edge angled toward the cellar's only crack of daylight. He sat before the 3 objects and looked at them. The map's job of guiding him across ground was finished, but what it carried did not end. It pointed back to the crater, to a stranger's last decision, to the months of choices that had kept Jacob alive. Alongside the identification tag, it was proof that the rescue had been real, that even in war's vast destruction, one specific life had pushed another back towards survival. The blurred photograph was the past he could not retrieve, a face he could not sharpen, a home that had existed only in memory until the moment he returned and found it erased. History's outcome did not change. The Allies won. Germany collapsed. Someone with a radio would announce it. Someone would shout it in a street. Someone would weep. The town would not rebuild because Jacob had returned. But the war inside him, the war of fear, hatred, numbness, and helplessness, had ended when Matthew Johnson forced the map into his hands and told him to go home. In its place was a heavy calm and one primitive task: stay alive. Jacob stepped out into thin spring sunlight, took the broken half-shovel, and began clearing a small patch of earth beside the shattered foundation. Maybe something could grow there if he could find seed. Behind him, deep in the cellar, the map lay open on the stone platform, old marks and new stains interwoven, silent on the rubble of war, pointing toward whatever came next.